Chapter 1. The Unexpected Summons. The village of St. Mary Mead lay under a thin blanket of January frost, the kind that made the thatched roofs sparkle in the weak afternoon sun. In her neat little cottage on the edge of the green, Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire with her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. A half-finished scarf in soft lavender wool lay across her lap, and a cup of tea cooled gently on the small table beside her. At 82, she moved a little more slowly than she once had, but her eyes, pale blue and deceptively mild, missed nothing. The postman's knock that morning had brought more than the usual bills and parish magazine. Among the letters was one on heavy cream paper, sealed with dark green wax, impressed with a crest she recognized at once. A stag rampant beneath a crown of oak leaves. The Hargrove family. It had been years since she last heard from Lady Eleanor Hargrove, yet here was her handwriting, elegant but hurried, on the envelope. Miss Marple slit it open with a silver letter opener and unfolded the single sheet. Winter Manor, near Much Benham. Oxfordshire, 3rd January. My dear Jane, I find myself in need of your company, and, if I may be frank, your particular talents. My brother-in-law, Sir Reginald, has summoned the family for what he calls a final reckoning this coming weekend. There are matters of inheritance, old grievances, and though he would never admit it, something that feels disturbingly like fear in the air. The weather promises to be severe, but the trains still run, and I would be most grateful if you could join us from Friday until Monday. I have enclosed a timetable and will send the motor to meet you at Much Benham Station. Do say you will come. I have not forgotten how cleverly you unravelled that unfortunate business at Gossington Hall all those years ago. There is no one whose judgment I trust more in times of trouble. Yours ever, Eleanor Hargrove. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it carefully on the mantelpiece. Lady Eleanor had always been a sensible woman, not given to dramatics. For her to write in such terms meant something was seriously amiss at Winter Manor. She glanced out of the window. The sky had taken on a leaden hue, and the wind was beginning to rattle the panes. A real storm was brewing. The wireless had warned of heavy snow moving down from the north. Most people would have considered the journey unwise for a woman of her age. Miss Marple, however, reached for her writing case. By tea-time she had penned a brief acceptance and handed it to the boy who ran errands for the post office. Then she began her preparations with the calm efficiency of long habit. Warm stockings, her thickest tweed coat, stout shoes, a hot water bottle, and, of course, her knitting bag, into which she slipped a small notebook and pencil. That evening, as she locked her front door and left the key with her maid Cherry, the first flakes of snow were already drifting past the street lamp. Miss Marple paused on the step, looking up at the darkening sky. People do such foolish things when money and family feeling are involved, she murmured to herself, and in an isolated house during a snowstorm. Well, one never knows. Friday dawned bitterly cold. Miss Marple caught the early train from the junction, changing at Oxford for the little branch line that wound through frozen fields to Much Benham. The carriage was almost empty, save for a commercial traveller dozing over his newspaper, and a young woman in a bright red coat who stared moodily out at the whitening landscape. At Much Benham Station, a gleaming black Bentley waited on the forecourt, its engine running to keep the chauffeur warm. The man touched his cap respectfully. "Miss Marple? Lady Eleanor's compliments, ma'am. Nasty weather coming, but we'll be snug at the manor before it closes in." The drive took them along narrow lanes already dusted white, past hedgerows bowed under frost, until the car turned between stone gateposts and began the long climb up a winding drive. At the crest of the hill stood Winter Manor itself, a great grey Elizabethan pile with tall chimneys and mullioned windows that caught the last of the daylight like chips of ice. As the car crunched to a halt on the gravel, the massive oak door opened and Lady Eleanor herself appeared on the threshold, wrapped in sable against the cold. "Jane, you came! I cannot tell you how relieved I am." She clasped Miss Marple's gloved hands warmly. Come in! It's perishing out here." The hall was vast and dimly lit, panelled in dark oak and hung with ancestral portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow the newcomer. A huge log fire blazed in the grate, throwing long shadows across suits of armour and an ancient refectory table laden with silver post. "Let me take your coat," Lady Eleanor said. "Grimsby will see to your luggage. Tea is ready in the drawing-room, and then I'll show you your room. The others have already arrived." "The others?" Miss Marple inquired mildly, surrendering her outdoor things to the butler. Lady Eleanor lowered her voice. "My nephew Geoffrey, heir presumptive and in desperate need of funds. His wife Diana, who spends money faster than he can lose it at cards. My late husband's American cousin, Mr. Lloyd Baxter, who claims an interest in the estate. Old Miss Lambert, Reginald's secretary companion for 30 years. She knows where all the skeletons are buried, sometimes quite literally. And of course, Reginald himself." She hesitated. "He has been strange lately. Obsessed with the billiard room. Spends hours there alone, marking scores that no one else can see. And he keeps talking about freezing what is owed." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. "The billiard room. It's at the far end of the west wing. Built by my father-in-law in 1890. Mahogany panelling, a full-size table, enormous fireplace. Reginald had the heating modernised only last year, yet he complains it is always cold. Superstitious nonsense, I dare say, but it unsettles the servants." A gong sounded somewhere deep in the house. "Dinner in an hour," Lady Eleanor said. "Come and meet everyone over tea." The drawing-room was warm and brightly lit, with long windows already sheeted in snow. A small group turned as the two women entered. Sir Reginald Hargrove stood with his back to the fire. Tall, gaunt, 75, but still imposing, with iron-grey hair and a hawk-like nose. His eyes, pale and piercing, fixed on Miss Marple with faint surprise. "Lady Eleanor's village friend," he said, as though explaining her presence to himself. "Welcome to Winter Manor, Mr. Marple." Geoffrey Hargrove, 30-ish, handsome in a dissipated way, lounged by the tea-table, pouring whisky instead of tea. His wife Diana, sleek and blonde in emerald silk, examined Miss Marple with the polite indifference reserved for the elderly and unimportant. Lloyd Baxter, broad-shouldered and transatlantic in tweeds, greeted her with hearty courtesy. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am. Any friend of Eleanor's is a friend of mine." Only Miss Lambert, thin and grey as a winter ash, offered a genuine, if nervous, smile. "How do you do? I do hope the journey wasn't too tiring." Tea was served, delicate sandwiches, scones, seed cake. Conversation skirted the edges of tension. The weather, the likelihood of being snowed in, the excellence of the shooting in better seasons. Beneath it all, Miss Marple sensed currents of unease. Sir Reginald spoke little, but his gaze kept drifting toward the door as though expecting an unwelcome visitor. At one point he muttered, almost to himself, "The room must be kept exactly as it was. No one is to touch the table until I say." Geoffrey laughed too loudly. "Uncle's convinced the ghost of Grandfather Hargrove Plays billiards at midnight. Wants to catch him in the act, I suppose." Sir Reginald's look silenced him. Outside, the wind rose to a howl, rattling the casements. Snow flung itself against the panes in frantic gusts. Lady Eleanor leaned close to Miss Marple. "You see, already it begins. By tomorrow we shall be cut off from the world. And Reginald has something planned for Sunday evening. Some announcement in the billiard room. He says it will settle everything once and for all." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Settlements," she said softly, "can be dangerous things when people feel they have been unfairly treated." Lady Eleanor shivered, though the room was warm. "I am glad you are here, Jane," she whispered. "I have a dreadful feeling that we shall need you." Upstairs, in the comfortable guest room with its four-poster bed and crackling fire, Miss Marple unpacked her few belongings. From her window, she could see the west wing, its windows already dark. Somewhere down there was the billiard room, waiting. She took out her notebook, wrote the date, and underneath it a single line. "Arrived Winter Manor. Storm approaching. Family gathered. Sir R. troubled about billiard room. Watch closely." Then she closed the book, placed it beside her bed, and began to prepare for dinner. Outside, the snow fell thicker and faster, erasing the outside world foot by foot. By morning, Winter Manor would be an island in a wide sea. And somewhere within its ancient walls, Miss Marple felt certain, a tragedy was already taking shape. Chapter 2. Arrival amid the blizzard. The storm struck with full fury shortly after Miss Marple's train pulled away from Oxford. What had begun as gentle flurries thickened into a swirling white curtain that blotted out the hedgerows and turned the sky the colour of wet slate. In the dimly lit carriage, the few remaining passengers drew their coats tighter and exchanged uneasy glances as the train lurched and slowed against the wind. Miss Marple sat composed, her gloved hands folded over her handbag, watching the snow lash the windows. She had seen many winters, but this one had a malevolent edge to it, as though the weather itself resented intrusion. The commercial traveller opposite her muttered about cancelled connections. The young woman in the red coat had fallen into a restless doze. No one spoke of anything cheerful. At Much Benham, the platform was almost deserted. A porter, muffled to the eyes, helped Miss Marple down the step and pointed toward the waiting Bentley. The chauffeur held the door open against the gale. "Bad night coming, miss," he shouted over the wind. "We'd best hurry." They set off up the hill road, headlights cutting pale tunnels through the flying snow. The wipers struggled, and twice the car fishtailed on fresh drifts before the chains bit and pulled them forward. Miss Marple noted how the driver's knuckles whitened on the wheel. Even a man used to country lanes was anxious tonight. Halfway up the drive, the manor lights appeared, golden windows glowing like a promise of warmth in the whiteness. When at last the car crunched to a halt before the great oak door, Miss Marple felt a quiet relief. Lady Eleanor herself opened it, a lamp in her hand, snowflakes melting on her dark hair. "You're safe, thank heavens," she said, drawing Miss Marple inside. "I was beginning to fear the roads would close before you arrived." The hall felt doubly welcoming after the bitter cold outside. Logs hissed and crackled in the huge fireplace. The air carried the scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and something savoury from the kitchens. Grimsby the butler took Miss Marple's coat and hat, murmuring that her luggage had already been carried upstairs. "Dinner in half an hour," Lady Eleanor said. "Come and warm yourself first. The others are in the drawing-room." As they crossed the flagged hall, Miss Marple paused beneath a full-length portrait of a Victorian Hargrove in shooting tweeds, billiard cue in hand. The man's eyes, cold and assessing, seemed to follow her. "My late father-in-law," Lady Eleanor explained quietly. "He had the billiard room built as his private sanctuary. Reginald is very like him. Same temperament, same obsession with the game." They entered the drawing room, a long apartment panelled in pale oak, its tall windows already sheeted with snow. A chandelier blazed above a grouping of sofas and chairs near another roaring fire. The assembled company turned as the two women came in. Sir Reginald Hargrove stood with his back to the flames, a glass of whisky in his hand. He inclined his head stiffly. "Miss Marple, you braved the weather, commendable." His tone suggested that bravery in elderly ladies was both unexpected and slightly irritating. Miss Marple smiled serenely and took the chair Lady Eleanor indicated. Geoffrey Hargrove rose with lazy courtesy. "Sherry, Miss Marple, or something stronger to keep out the cold?" "Sherry, thank you." She accepted the glass and studied him over the rim. Geoffrey was handsome in the rather spoiled way of men who have always had money, or expected it. Tonight his eyes were restless, flicking toward his uncle whenever Sir Reginald spoke. Diana Hargrove, in a gown of shimmering silver lame that seemed designed for Mayfair rather than an Oxfordshire blizzard, gave Miss Marple a polite nod before returning to her conversation with Lloyd Baxter. The American sat forward, elbows on knees, telling some anecdote that made Diana laugh a little too brightly. Old Miss Lambert hovered near the tea tray, thin hands fluttering as she arranged cups that needed no arranging. When she noticed Miss Marple watching, she offered a nervous smile. "I do hope the storm won't frighten you, Miss Marple. We're quite cut off when it's bad." "I have always found isolation instructive," Miss Marple replied mildly. "One sees people so much more clearly when there is nowhere for them to hide." Miss Lambert coloured and busied herself with the teapot. Dinner was announced with a deeper, more resonant gong. The party moved into the dining room, a baronial hall with a hammer-beam roof, suits of armour in the corners, and a long table, gleaming with silver and candlelight. Snow tapped insistently at the high lancet windows as they took their places. Sir Reginald sat at the head, Lady Eleanor at the foot. Miss Marple found herself between Geoffrey and Miss Lambert, opposite Diana and Mr. Baxter. The first course, clear soup fragrant with herbs, was served by two footmen who moved silently, despite the winds howling outside. Conversation began politely. The difficulty of travel, the beauty of the manor in summer, the excellence of the wine. But beneath the civility, Miss Marple sensed strain, like a wire drawn too tight. Geoffrey drank rather quickly, and spoke of his latest losses at cards, with a lightness that did not reach his eyes. Diana complained prettily about the lack of bridge players. Lloyd Baxter praised English country houses with transatlantic enthusiasm. Yet his gaze kept drifting to Sir Reginald as though measuring him. Halfway through the fish, Sir Reginald set down his fork with a small, deliberate clink. "I have asked you all here for a purpose," he said abruptly. His voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of the room. "On Sunday evening, in the billiard room, I intend to settle certain matters once and for all. Debts, expectations, obligations, everything will be made plain." A silence fell. Geoffrey's wineglass paused halfway to his lips. Diana's manicured fingers tightened on her napkin. Even the footman seemed to still. "Sunday," Geoffrey repeated, forcing a smile. Plenty of time for a few frames beforehand, eh, uncle?" Sir Reginald's pale eyes fixed on his nephew. "The table will remain untouched until then. I have given orders." Miss Lambert gave a small, involuntary gasp. Lady Eleanor intervened smoothly. "Reginald, we have a guest who has only just arrived. Perhaps we might speak of pleasanter things tonight." Sir Reginald inclined his head, but the atmosphere had chilled. The rest of the meal passed in careful commonplaces. The roast beef was admirable, the soufflé light as air, but no one had much appetite. Afterwards the ladies withdrew, leaving the men to port and cigars. In the drawing-room, coffee was served. Diana lit a cigarette with rather trembling fingers and declared she was exhausted from the journey. Miss Lambert excused herself almost immediately, murmuring about letters to write. Soon only Lady Eleanor and Miss Marple remained by the fire. "You see how it is," Lady Eleanor said in a low voice. "Reginald has been brooding for months over the estate, the trusts, Geoffrey's extravagance. And there is something else, something about the American branch of the family that he will not discuss. He spends hours alone in that billiard room, chalking cues, lining up impossible shots, talking to himself." "Talking?" Miss Marple asked gently. "About balances, about things being frozen in place until the proper reckoning. The servants are uneasy. One parlour-maid gave notice last week because she heard footsteps in the west wing at night when everyone was abed. Outside, the wind screamed around the eaves like a living thing. Snow had begun to pile against the lower windows. Lady Eleanor shivered. I tell myself it is only an old man's fancy, but I cannot shake the feeling that something dreadful is coming." Miss Marple patted her hand. "We shall see what Sunday brings. In the meantime, let us keep our eyes and ears open." A clock struck 11. Lady Eleanor rose. "I'll have Grimsby show you to your room. You must be weary." The guest bedroom was in the east wing, warm and comfortable with a fire burning low. A hot water bottle had been placed between the sheets, and Miss Marple's night things laid out. She dismissed the maid with thanks, drew the heavy curtains, and stood listening. The storm raged unabated. Somewhere far off in the house, a door banged. Footsteps crossed a distant corridor and faded. Miss Marple opened her notebook by the bedside lamp and added a few lines dinner tense. "Sir R. threatens announcement Sunday in billiard room. Table not to be touched. General unease. Geoffrey anxious, Diana nervous, Baxter watchful. Miss L. frightened. Storm worsening, roads almost certainly impassable by morning." She closed the book, said her prayers and climbed into bed. The wind howled like a banshee around the chimneys, but Miss Marple had slept through air raids in her time. Within minutes she was asleep. Downstairs, in the locked billiard room at the end of the west wing, a single lamp burned. Sir Reginald Hargrove stood alone beside the great mahogany table, a cue in his hand. The fire had burned low, yet the room felt unnaturally cold. He chalked the tips slowly, deliberately, then leaned down to sight along an imaginary shot. "Everything in its place," he muttered. "Everything frozen until the reckoning." Outside the long windows, snow piled higher and higher, sealing Winter Manor from the world. By dawn, the drifts would be 5 feet deep against the doors, the telephone lines down, the lane to the village erased. No one would come in, no one would leave. The house was an island now, and its inhabitants prisoners of the storm, and of whatever darkness waited in the frozen billiard room. Chapter 3. Whispers in the halls. Morning light filtered weakly through the drawing-room windows. A pale, diffused glow that turned the snow-covered gardens into a blinding white expanse. Winter Manor was utterly silent, except for the occasional creak of old timbers and the muffled thud of snow sliding from overloaded branches outside. The storm had spent its fury in the night. Now the world lay buried under drifts higher than a man's head. The telephone lines were down, no click when the receiver was lifted, and the lane to Much Benham had vanished entirely. They were isolated, as completely as if the house had been set adrift on an ice floe. Miss Marple came downstairs a little after 9, warmly wrapped in a soft grey cardigan over her wool dress. The hall fire had been freshly made up, but the air still carried a chill that seemed to seep from the very stones. Grimsby informed her that Lady Eleanor was in the morning room, and that breakfast was laid in the small dining room, as the great hall felt too cavernous on such a day. Only Miss Lambert was at the table when Miss Marple entered, picking at a piece of toast as though it might bite back. She looked up with a start. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Did you sleep well?" "Tolerably, thank you," Miss Marple replied, helping herself to porridge from the silver dish on the sideboard. "The wind was very loud, but I am used to that. And you?" Miss Lambert gave a thin smile. "I heard movements in the west wing long after everyone had retired. Footsteps, I think, or perhaps the house settling." She glanced toward the door as though expecting someone to appear. Sir Reginald often walks at night when he cannot sleep. They were joined presently by Diana Hargrove, yawning delicately behind a manicured hand, and complaining that the central heating seemed inadequate. Geoffrey followed, tousled and heavy-eyed, pouring himself coffee with a liberal dash of brandy from a flask in his dressing-gown pocket. Lloyd Baxter appeared last of the guests, hearty and apparently unaffected by the weather. "Some storm!" he boomed, piling his plate with eggs and bacon. "Reminds me of a nor'easter back in Maine. We'll be digging out for a week." Sir Reginald did not come down to breakfast at all. Lady Eleanor explained quietly that he had asked for a tray in his study and wished to be undisturbed until luncheon. After the meal, the party scattered, driven indoors by the cold. Geoffrey and Baxter adjourned to the library to look over guns in the glass cabinet and discuss shooting that would now certainly not take place. Diana declared her intention of writing letters. Though with the post impossible, this seemed more habit than purpose, and disappeared upstairs. Miss Lambert returned to her secretarial duties. Lady Eleanor suggested to Miss Marple that they might take a turn about the house. "There are parts you have not seen," she said, "and on a day like this one must keep moving or grow stiff." They began in the long gallery that ran the length of the south front, lined with family portraits and faded tapestries. Snowlight glimmered through the high windows, throwing ghostly patterns on the polished floor. Lady Eleanor spoke softly of the house's history. Built in Elizabeth's reign, enlarged by a Georgian Hargrove who made a fortune in the East India trade, modernized only reluctantly in the present century. As they reached the far end, a narrower corridor led toward the west wing. A baize door separated it from the main part of the house. "The servants' domain lies beyond," Lady Eleanor explained, "but the billiard room is along here. Reginald had it placed at the very end so that the noise of play would not disturb the family." They paused at the door, which stood slightly ajar. From within came the faint click of ivory against ivory, a solitary game in progress. Lady Eleanor hesitated. "Perhaps we should not," but Miss Marple's curiosity was gently insistent. "A quick glance only. I've always found billiard rooms most revealing of character." They stepped quietly into the corridor, The air grew noticeably colder with every pace. At the end, double doors of dark mahogany stood wide open, revealing the room beyond. It was a magnificent apartment, 30 feet long, panelled in rich walnut, with a massive stone fireplace in which a fire burned brightly. Above the mantel hung a full-sized portrait of the Victorian Hargrove Miss Marple had noticed in the hall, the one holding a cue. The billiard table itself dominated the centre. A superb full-sized Thurston, its green cloth immaculate, balls racked precisely in the middle as though no game had ever been played. Sir Reginald stood alone at the far end, cue in hand, studying an arrangement of balls with fierce concentration. He wore a thick tweed jacket despite the fire, and his breath showed faintly in the air. He did not notice the two women at first. He leaned down, took careful aim, and struck. The cue ball rolled smoothly, kissed the red, and sent it gliding into a pocket with a soft thud. Sir Reginald straightened, chalked his cue, and muttered something inaudible. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the words, "Frozen assets. Time to settle the score." Lady Eleanor touched Miss Marple's arm and drew her back into the corridor. They retreated silently until they were once more behind the baize door. "You heard?" Lady Eleanor whispered. Miss Marple nodded. "He plays alone, yet speaks of scores and settlements. Curious." They continued their tour, but the chill of the west wing seemed to follow them. In the conservatory, glass-roofed and filled with palms now drooping under snow, they encountered Diana, wrapped in furs, staring moodily at the white world outside. "Ghastly, isn't it?" she said, "trapped like rats. And Geoffrey's in a foul temper because he can't get to London." Lady Eleanor murmured something soothing and moved on. In the servants' hall, they found the maids clustered around the range, whispering. When the two ladies appeared, conversation stopped abruptly. Later, in the warm morning room, Lady Eleanor poured coffee. "The staff are restless," she confided. "There is an old story about the billiard room, something that happened in my father-in-law's time. A young man, a guest, died there one Christmas. Heart failure, they said, but the room was bitterly cold, though the fire had been lit all evening. Ever since, when snow lies deep, the servants say the room remembers." Miss Marple sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Country houses accumulate stories the way old trees gather moss. Some are mere superstition, but others have roots in truth. Luncheon was a strained affair. Sir Reginald appeared at last, silent and preoccupied. Geoffrey tried to draw him into talk of estate matters and was sharply rebuffed. Baxter asked polite questions about the history of the table and received only curt replies. Diana toyed with her food. Miss Lambert scarcely ate at all. Afterwards, snow still falling lightly, the party gathered in the drawing room. Someone suggested cards, but no one had the heart for bridge. Geoffrey proposed exploring the attics for old theatrical costumes, anything to break the monotony, but the idea died. Instead, conversation turned inevitably to family matters. Baxter mentioned, with careful casualness, that he had papers relating to a trust set up by a common ancestor in America. Geoffrey's eyes narrowed. Diana looked suddenly alert. Sir Reginald rose abruptly. "Those papers will keep until Sunday," he said. "I have work to do." He left the room. A moment later they heard his firm tread along the west corridor. Miss Lambert excused herself almost immediately, murmuring about correspondence. The remaining four sat in awkward silence until Lady Eleanor suggested tea might be brought early. While they waited, Miss Marple took out her knitting and appeared to concentrate on a complicated heel. In reality, she listened. Geoffrey lit a cigarette with unnecessary force. "The old man's playing some deep game," he muttered to Diana. "All this mystery about Sunday, if he's planning to cut me out." "Hush," Diana said quickly, glancing toward Lady Eleanor. But Eleanor had heard. She set down her cup with a small clink. "My brother-in-law is not vindictive," she said quietly, "but he is just. He believes Geoffrey has been imprudent." Geoffrey laughed bitterly. "Imprudent? That's rich. Who paid for Diana's furs and my club debts all these years, if not the estate?" Baxter cleared his throat. "Family money matters are always delicate," he said smoothly, "but perhaps Sir Reginald simply wants everything clear and legal." "Legal?" Geoffrey repeated. "Yes, that's what I'm afraid of." Tea arrived, ending the conversation, but the atmosphere remained heavy. Outside, dusk came early under the low clouds. Lamps were lit, fires stoked higher. The house seemed to draw in upon itself against the cold. That evening after dinner, another excellent meal eaten in near silence, Miss Marple suggested that someone might read aloud. Miss Lambert coaxed, produced a volume of ghost stories, but the choice proved unfortunate. Every creak of the old house seemed to echo the tales. At 10 o'clock Sir Reginald retired early, pleading a headache. The others lingered only briefly before seeking their rooms. Miss Marple, in her comfortable bedroom, sat by the dying fire a little longer. She opened her notebook and added carefully, "Saturday. House completely cut off. Sirrah plays solitary billiard game, speaks of frozen assets and settling scores. General tension increasing. Geoffrey resentful, Diana anxious. Baxter watchful, Miss L frightened. Old story of death in billiard room during snow. Servants uneasy." She paused, listening. Far off in the west wing came the faint click of balls once more. Steady, methodical, endless. Somewhere in this snowbound house, she thought, someone is preparing a stroke that will send more than ivory balls into motion. And when Sunday comes, the game will be played in deadly earnest. She closed the book, banked the fire, and went to bed. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, silently, covering every track, sealing every secret beneath its white shroud. Chapter 4. The Icy Discovery. Sunday dawned still and bright, the kind of crystalline winter morning that follows a great storm. Sunlight poured through the east windows of Winter Manor, striking sparks from the snow that lay in smooth, unbroken drifts across lawns and terraces. Every twig and branch glittered with frost. The world outside looked newly made and utterly silent. Inside, the house stirred slowly. Servants moved quietly about their duties, speaking in lowered voices as though reluctant to disturb the hush. Miss Marple came down a little before 9, drawn by the smell of coffee and toast drifting from the morning room. She found Lady Eleanor already there, standing at the window with a cup untouched in her hand. "Good morning, Jane," she said, but her smile was strained. "The snow has stopped at last. Beautiful, isn't it? Yet somehow oppressive." Miss Marple joined her at the window. The west wing lay in full sunlight, its long row of windows flashing like mirrors. No footprints marred the snow beneath them. No one had passed that way since the storm began. "Sir Reginald has not appeared?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Lady Eleanor shook her head. "His tray was taken up at 8. The maid knocked, but there was no answer. She assumed he was still sleeping. He was very late retiring. He often is, when he has been, in the billiard room." They breakfasted lightly together. The others trickled in. Geoffrey sullen and red-eyed, Diana pale beneath her careful makeup, Baxter cheerful as ever. Miss Lambert did not come down at all. At 10 o'clock, Sir Reginald had still not emerged. Geoffrey suggested, half-jokingly, that his uncle was sulking and ought to be left in peace until his grand announcement that evening. But Lady Eleanor grew increasingly uneasy. "Reginald is punctual to a fault," she said. "He always breakfasts at 9, even when unwell. I think someone should look in on him." Geoffrey shrugged. "I'll go if you like." He returned 5 minutes later, frowning. "Doors locked from the inside. Knocked till my knuckles ached. No reply. Probably took a sleeping draught and is dead to the world." Lady Eleanor's face whitened. "The billiard room, then. He sometimes dozes there in his chair after a late night." The suggestion hung in the air. No one moved at first. Then Baxter stood. "I'll come with you, ma'am, just to set your mind at rest." Miss Marple rose quietly. "And I." They crossed the hall and passed through the baize door into the west corridor. The air grew colder with every step, as though the house itself held its breath. At the far end, the double doors of the billiard room stood closed. Lady Eleanor knocked softly. "Reginald, it's Eleanor." Silence. She tried the handle. The doors opened easily. They stepped inside and stopped. The great room was transformed into a chamber of ice. Frost feathered every surface, the panelling, the portrait above the mantel, even the green baize of the table. The fire in the huge grate had burned down to grey ash, yet the air was bitterly, unnaturally cold. Their breath hung in clouds before them. In the centre of the room, seated in a high leather chair beside the table, was Sir Reginald Hargrove. He was frozen solid. His body was upright, rigid, encased in a thin sheath of ice that glittered in the sunlight streaming through the windows. His eyes stared sightlessly at the billiard table. His right hand still gripped a cue, as though arrested in the act of play. Rime whitened his hair and eyebrows. His tweed jacket was stiff with frost. Even the whisky glass on the small table beside him held a solid core of ice. Lady Eleanor gave a low, choked cry and swayed. Baxter caught her arm. Miss Marple moved forward slowly, her sensible shoes crunching on frost that coated the floor. She touched the back of Sir Reginald's hand with one gloved finger. It was hard as marble and colder than any corpse she had ever encountered. "Dead some hours," she said quietly, "and frozen, completely frozen." Behind them, Geoffrey appeared in the doorway, summoned by the cry. He took one look and turned a sickly green. "Good God!" he whispered. Diana pushed past him, stared, and screamed, a high, tearing sound that echoed through the room. Miss Lambert, drawn by the commotion, arrived moments later and promptly fainted into Baxter's arms. Miss Marple ignored the confusion. She was studying the scene with calm, terrible concentration. The billiard table itself was a study in horror. The green cloth was glazed with ice. The balls, racked in perfect triangle, were each encased in a clear sphere of frost, like specimens in glass. The cue ball rested separately at the bulk end, as though a break had been about to begin. Chalk dust on the table had frozen into delicate blue-white patterns. Most strange of all were the windows. Every pane was thick with frost on the inside, yet outside the sun blazed on untouched snow. No window was broken, no drift had entered. The door had been closed. There were no footprints in the frost on the floor except their own. Miss Marple bent to examine the fireplace. Ash lay cold and undisturbed. The flue was open, no blockage, yet the room had turned into a freezer overnight. She straightened and looked about. On the floor near Sir Reginald's chair lay a single snooker ball, the red displaced from the rack. It too was coated in ice, but beneath the frost she could see a faint mark, as though it had been struck hard and rolled. On the small table beside the body, next to the frozen whisky glass, was a folded sheet of heavy notepaper. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully with gloved fingers. Written in Sir Reginald's angular hand were the words, "The score is settled. Everything is frozen as it should be. Look to the table for the truth." Below the message, someone had added in hurried pencil, clearly a different hand, a single line, too late. The cue was chalked for murder. Miss Marple folded the note again and slipped it into her pocket. By now, the entire household had gathered in the corridor. Maids whispering, footmen wide-eyed, the cook wringing her apron. Grimsby stood pale but composed, awaiting orders. Lady Eleanor had recovered enough to speak. "The police," she said faintly. "We must fetch the police." Baxter shook his head grimly. "Telephone's dead, ma'am. Road's buried under 6 feet of snow. The village constable can't reach us, and we can't reach him. We're on our own." Geoffrey found his voice. "Locked room. Frozen solid. Impossible. It's like something out of a sensation novel." Miss Marple turned to them all, her voice steady. "Not impossible, Mr. Hargrove. Merely clever, and very wicked. Sir Reginald was murdered. There can be no doubt of it. The question is how, and by whom?" She looked around the circle of shocked faces. Geoffrey's defiance masking fear. Diana's hysteria barely contained. Baxter's careful composure. Miss Lambert's white, trembling silence. Lady Eleanor's grief. "And until the thaw comes," Miss Marple continued quietly, "we are all prisoners here, with the murderer." She glanced once more at the frozen figure in the chair, at the glittering table, at the message in her pocket. "Grimsby," she said, "please close the doors and see that no one enters this room alone. We must preserve everything exactly as it is." The butler inclined his head. "Very good, miss." As the doors swung shut, sealing the icy tableau within, Miss Marple felt the house settle around them like a trap closing. Somewhere in its ancient walls a killer walked free, confident that snow and ice had hidden every trace. But Miss Marple had seen many murderers believe themselves safe behind locked doors and perfect alibis. She took out her knitting as they returned to the drawing-room, needles clicking softly. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent. And murderers, however clever, always left something behind. Some small, overlooked detail that did not fit. In the frozen billiard room, that detail was waiting. She intended to find it. Chapter 5. Shadows of Suspicion. The drawing-room felt smaller that afternoon, as though the walls had drawn inward under the weight of what lay at the end of the west corridor. Sunlight still blazed on the snow outside, but inside the fire burned low, and the curtains had been half closed against the glare. No one suggested opening them wider. The bright, merciless light seemed an intruder. Lady Eleanor sat very straight on the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had recovered her composure with the effort of long practice, but her face was pale and drawn. Geoffrey paced restlessly, a cigarette smouldering between his fingers. Diana sat apart in a high-backed chair, staring at nothing, a brandy glass untouched beside her. Lloyd Baxter stood by the mantel, occasionally poking the fire with unnecessary vigour. Miss Lambert, revived with smelling salts, perched on the edge of a small chair, twisting a handkerchief into knots. Miss Marple, calm and inconspicuous in her corner, had taken out her knitting again. Soft grey wool that grew steadily into a sock. The needles clicked with deliberate rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the tension in the room. No one had spoken for several minutes when she laid the knitting aside and addressed them gently. "We cannot pretend this is an accident or a natural death," she said. "Sir Reginald was murdered in a most ingenious manner. The local constable cannot reach us, nor can we send for a doctor or the police. Therefore, until the thaw comes, we must do what we can to establish the truth ourselves." Geoffrey gave a short, bitter laugh. "You mean play detective, Miss Marple? In this house, with one of us a murderer?" "Exactly so," she replied mildly. "And since one of us is indeed a murderer, it behoves the rest of us to be very careful and very honest." Lady Eleanor found her voice. "Jane is right. We cannot simply wait in fear. Reginald deserved better than that." Baxter cleared his throat. "Practical point. The body must be preserved. That room is already like an icehouse. If we keep the doors closed and the fire out, the cold will continue." Miss Marple nodded. "A grim necessity, but wise. Grimsby has posted a footman outside the door. Nothing will be disturbed." She paused, looking around the circle of faces. "I think it best if we each tell, quite simply, where we were last night after dinner and what we did until retiring. No one need feel accused yet, but alibis, even partial ones, may help us eliminate possibilities." An uneasy silence followed. Then Baxter spoke first, his tone measured. "I played a few hands of patience in the library until about 11. Grimsby brought me a whisky at 10:30. I remember because we spoke of the storm. After that, I went up to my room. My bedroom is above the stables. I heard nothing from the west wing." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Thank you, Mr. Baxter." Diana spoke next, her voice brittle. "I went to bed early, soon after the ladies left the dining room. I had a headache. My maid brought me aspirin and hot milk at 10. I read for perhaps half an hour, and then put out the light." "And you, Mr. Hargrove?" Miss Marple asked Geoffrey. He stubbed out his cigarette with unnecessary force. "I stayed in the dining room with Uncle for a while. He wanted to talk about estate matters. He was in a foul mood, said I'd bled the trust dry. We argued. I left him around 10 and went to the gun room to clean a shotgun I'd been looking at earlier. Baxter joined me there for a bit. We talked about American versus English barrels. I went up about 11:30. Baxter nodded confirmation. "That's right. We parted in the corridor." Miss Lambert's voice was scarcely audible. "I typed some letters in the morning room until nearly midnight. Sir Reginald had asked me to finish them urgently. Then I went straight to bed. My room is next to Lady Eleanor's." Lady Eleanor said quietly, "I read in my sitting room until 11, then looked in on Miss Lambert to say good night. After that I retired. I heard nothing unusual." Miss Marple turned last to the servants who had been summoned. Grimsby, the 2 footmen, the parlour-maid, and the cook. Their accounts were simple. The staff had retired to their quarters shortly after clearing dinner. No one admitted to being in the west wing after 10 o'clock. The footman on night duty had dozed by the kitchen fire and heard nothing. "Thank you all," Miss Marple said. "That gives us a starting point." She rose and suggested that she be allowed to examine the billiard room again, with Lady Eleanor and Baxter as witnesses. No one objected. The 3 of them returned to the west wing. The footman stood aside, and they entered the frozen chamber. Nothing had changed. Sir Reginald sat rigid in his chair, ice glinting on his eyelashes. The message Miss Marple had found still lay where she had replaced it. She studied the room afresh. First the door, a heavy double door with a Yale lock and an old-fashioned bolt on the inside. The bolt was shot home. The key was in the lock on the inner side. Locked from within, Baxter observed, and no other door. Miss Marple examined the windows. All were fastened securely, frost thick on the inside panes. She scraped a small circle clear on one and peered out. The snow beneath lay smooth and unmarked. She turned to the fireplace, cold ash as before. But beside the grate she noticed something new. A small brass ventilation grill set low in the wall, almost hidden by a leather armchair. She knelt stiffly and peered through the slats. "An air duct," she murmured. "Modern heating, I think. It runs along the wall." Baxter crouched beside her. "Central heating pipes. They were installed last year. But why is it so cold in here?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was looking at the floor near the duct. A faint white powder dusted the boards, barely visible against the frost. She touched it with a gloved finger and raised it to the light. It sparkled, then began to melt. "Not ordinary dust," she said softly. Back in the drawing room, she asked Grimsby to bring strong coffee, and then addressed the company again. "Certain facts are clear," she began. "Sir Reginald was alive after dinner. He argued with Mr. Geoffrey. He came here alone, locked the door, and sat down to play or to wait. Sometime in the night he died, and the room became intensely cold, cold enough to freeze a glass of whisky and preserve the body almost instantly." Diana shuddered. "But how? The fire was lit. He always kept it blazing when he played late." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "Yet the fire went out, and the temperature dropped far below freezing. That suggests something artificial, something introduced into the room." Geoffrey frowned. "Introduced how? The door was locked and bolted from inside, windows shut." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "There is a ventilation duct connected to the central heating. Someone who understood the system might have tampered with it." Lady Eleanor gasped. "But that would require knowledge of the boiler, the pipes, and access during the night," Miss Marple finished. "The servants' quarters are near the boiler room." Cook, who had lingered in the doorway, bridled. "None of my people would do such a thing, ma'am." "I am sure they would not," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But someone might have gone down unobserved." She paused, then asked quietly, "Has anyone seen anything unusual in the boiler room lately? Tools misplaced? A container out of place?" Grimsby hesitated. "There was a tin of chemicals, miss. The sort the gardener uses for killing weeds. It went missing a fortnight ago. I thought young Tom had taken it for the greenhouses." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "What sort of chemicals? Dry ice, I believe, for fumigating or some such. Comes in blocks, but can be powdered." A stir ran through the room. Baxter whistled softly. "Dry ice," he said, "sublimes straight to gas. Carbon dioxide. Heavy, cold, colder than ordinary ice. Enough of it pumped into a closed room would freeze everything," Miss Marple finished, "and suffocate a man quietly in his chair." Geoffrey stared at her. "But the duct. Someone would have had to open the grill, force the stuff in, and close it again," Miss Marple agreed, leaving no trace but a little powder on the floor. Diana's voice rose hysterically. "Then it was one of the servants. They had access. Or someone who knew the house well enough to move about unseen," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Someone who could go to the boiler room without arousing suspicion." The implications hung heavy in the air. Miss Marple took up her knitting again. We have motives in plenty. Money, Mr. Geoffrey's debts. Inheritance, Mr. Baxter's claim. Long-standing resentment, perhaps Miss Lambert's. Even fear of what Sir Reginald intended to reveal tonight. Miss Lambert gave a small cry. I had no reason, but her eyes were terrified. Lady Eleanor stood. This is intolerable. We are accusing one another like frightened children. Better to accuse openly than to suspect in silence, Miss Marple said. The truth will out, Lady Eleanor. It always does. Outside, the sun began to dip toward the white hills. Shadows lengthened across the snow. In the locked billiard room, the frozen figure waited, patient as death itself. And in the drawing room, the shadows of suspicion deepened, binding them all in a net of fear and deceit from which only the truth could cut them free. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, steady and implacable. Chapter 6. The Melting Truths. Monday brought the first signs of thaw. Water dripped steadily from the eaves, and the snow on the south-facing slopes began to sag and slide in heavy wet slabs. The sky was a dull pewter, the air raw and damp. Inside Winter Manor the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The bright clarity of the previous day had given way to a grey, clinging unease. Miss Marple rose early, and after a solitary breakfast, asked Grimsby to accompany her to the billiard room. The footman still stood guard outside the door, stiff from his long vigil. When the doors were opened, a breath of icy air rolled out like mist from a crypt. Sir Reginald's frozen figure remained exactly as they had left it, glinting faintly in the thin light that filtered through frosted windows. Miss Marple did not approach the body. Instead, she moved to the billiard table itself, studying the perfect triangle of balls encased in their spheres of ice. With gloved fingers, she brushed frost from the mahogany rail and examined the leather pockets. In the far corner pocket, something caught her eye, a corner of white paper protruding very slightly. She drew it out carefully. It was a folded sheet, crisp with cold. Unfolding it, she read, "The American Trust is a forgery. Proof in the table drawer. Do not let Baxter have what is not his." R.H. Grimsby's eyes widened. "Shall I fetch the others, miss?" "In a little while," Miss Marple replied. "First, the drawer." The long drawer beneath the table was locked, but the key hung on a small hook inside the scoreboard cabinet, an old habit of Sir Reginald's. Miss Marple turned it gently. Inside lay a bundle of documents tied with red tape, and beneath them a small leather-bound ledger. She carried both to the light. The documents were legal papers relating to a supposed trust established in New York in 1898. The ledger contained Sir Reginald's meticulous notes, dates, references to correspondence, and finally, in his precise hand, Baxter's papers examined by solicitor in London, November last. Signature of witness forged. Entire claim fraudulent. Confrontation intended Sunday evening. Miss Marple closed the ledger thoughtfully. So that was the announcement he planned. She replaced everything exactly as found, locked the drawer, and returned the key. Only then did she summon the household. They assembled in the drawing room, faces pale in the grey light. Lady Eleanor looked as though she had not slept. Geoffrey was unshaven and restless. Diana chain-smoked. Baxter maintained his calm, but his eyes were watchful. Miss Lambert sat apart, hands trembling in her lap. Miss Marple stood quietly before the fire. "I have found certain papers hidden in the billiard table," she began without preamble. "They prove that Mr. Baxter's claim to a share in the estate rests on forged documents. Sir Reginald discovered the fraud some months ago and intended to expose it last evening." A gasp escaped Diana. Geoffrey swore softly. Baxter's face remained impassive. "That is a serious accusation, Miss Marple," he said evenly. "May one see these papers?" "They will be produced in due course," she replied, "but there is more." She turned to Lady Eleanor. "May I borrow your keys to the West Wing attics?" Puzzled, Lady Eleanor handed them over. Miss Marple requested Baxter and Geoffrey to accompany her. They climbed narrow stairs to the dusty attics above the West Wing. In a small lumber room, behind stacks of old trunks, Miss Marple pointed to a large tin marked Gardener's Stores. Geoffrey lifted it down. Inside were remnants of block-dry ice, now reduced to a damp powder at the bottom, and a length of flexible rubber tubing. Baxter stared at it. "I don't understand." "The murderer," Miss Marple explained quietly, "removed a block of dry ice from this tin, where it had been hidden after being taken from the gardener's shed. During the night, he or she carried it to the boiler room, connected the tubing to the ventilation duct serving the billiard room, and introduced the sublimating gas. The heavy carbon dioxide displaced the air, suffocating Sir Reginald as he dozed in his chair. The extreme cold that followed froze the room and preserved the scene." Geoffrey whistled. "But the door was bolted from inside. How did the murderer get out?" Miss Marple led them back downstairs to the billiard room. She pointed to the bolt on the double doors. "A simple device," she said. "A length of black thread, almost invisible against the dark mahogany, passed through a tiny hole, drilled in the door, looped over the bolt, and carried out beneath the gap at the bottom. Once outside, a steady pull slid the bolt home. The thread was then drawn through the hole and retrieved. I found the small hole this morning, stopped with a dab of matching wood filler, hastily done." She produced a fragment of black thread from her pocket. Baxter's composure cracked for the first time. "This is conjecture. No," Miss Marple said gently. "It is reconstruction. And there is one more piece." She returned to the table and pointed to the single red ball lying on the floor near Sir Reginald's chair. This ball was struck deliberately after the room began to freeze. It rolled a short distance and stopped. But notice the faint mark on its surface. A thumbprint in the frost, partially melted. The murderer, in haste, picked it up to return it to the rack, but dropped it when the cold became too intense. Geoffrey bent to look. A print! But whose? Miss Marple turned to Miss Lambert, who had followed them silently, and now stood in the doorway, white as the snow outside. "Yours, I think, Miss Lambert. You have a small scar on your right thumb, from a typewriter accident years ago. You told me yesterday when we spoke of old injuries. The print will match." Miss Lambert gave a low moan and clutched the doorframe. Lady Eleanor stared at her. "Agnes, why?" Miss Lambert's voice was a thread. "He was going to dismiss me. 30 years of service, and because I defended Geoffrey's right to his expectations, because I told him the boy had been misled, he said I had become impertinent. After the announcement, he intended to send me away with a pittance. I could not bear it." She began to weep silently. Baxter spoke harshly. "So you killed him to protect your position?" "And Geoffrey's," she whispered. "I thought if Reginald died before the exposure, the forgery would never come to light and Geoffrey would inherit everything. I did not know about the papers in the table." Geoffrey turned away, face twisted. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "You use the old story of the cursed billiard room to suggest something supernatural. You relied on the storm to delay discovery. But you overlooked small things. The powder by the vent, the thread hole, the thumbprint. Miss Lambert sank to her knees. I am sorry, so sorry. He was not a kind man, but he did not deserve that. Lady Eleanor moved to her side, helping her to rise. Come, Agnes. We will look after you until the police can come. As they led the weeping woman away, Baxter cleared his throat. I suppose my position here is awkward? I had no idea the papers were forged. My father believed them genuine. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. That may be so. The police will decide. He nodded stiffly and left the room. Geoffrey lingered. I feel like a fool, he muttered. All my debts, my extravagance, and someone killed to protect me from the consequences. Consequences are often kinder teachers than indulgence, Miss Marple said quietly. He gave a rueful smile and followed the others. Alone in the billiard room, Miss Marple stood a moment longer. The ice on the table was beginning to melt. Tiny rivulets ran across the green cloth. The frozen balls glistened wetly. Even Sir Reginald's rigid figure showed the first signs of thaw, droplets forming on his eyelashes like tears. She closed the doors softly behind her. In the hall, the thaw continued. Water dripped from the porch. The snow slid in great sheets from the roof. By evening, the lane might be passable. By tomorrow, the police would come. But the greater thaw, the melting of fear and deceit, was already underway. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, took up her knitting, and waited patiently for the final act. Chapter 7. Chilled Confessions. Tuesday evening brought a soft, steady rain that washed the last heavy snow from the roofs and turned the drifts into slushy rivers running down the drive. The telephone lines were restored by midday. A terse call to the county police brought the promise of a detective inspector and a doctor first thing in the morning. Until then, Winter Manor remained in limbo, its secrets half revealed, its inhabitants moving like ghosts through the dimly lit rooms. Miss Marple suggested that they gather one final time in the drawing-room after dinner. The meal had been silent, almost funereal. Even the claret tasted flat. When coffee was served, the servants withdrew, and Grimsby closed the doors with a quiet solemnity that suggested he, too, understood what was coming. The fire had been built high, yet the room felt cold. Rain lashed the windows, water dripped from the eaves in a steady, mournful rhythm. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner, knitting folded neatly in her lap. She looked around the circle with mild, compassionate eyes. "We have reached the point," she said quietly, "where pretense is no longer possible, or kind. The police will arrive tomorrow. They will ask questions we have already asked one another, but with the authority of the law behind them. It would be better, far better, if the truth were laid before them willingly tonight." No one spoke. The fire crackled. Rain hissed against the panes. Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone. Sir Reginald Hargrove was murdered in the billiard room by means of dry ice introduced through the ventilation duct. The door was bolted from within by a simple thread device. Papers hidden in the table drawer prove that Mr. Baxter's claim on the estate was based on forgery, and a thumbprint on a frozen billiard ball, together with other small traces, points unmistakably to Miss Lambert. Miss Lambert, who had been sitting very still beside Lady Eleanor, gave a low, heartbroken sound. Tears began to slide silently down her cheeks. Geoffrey stirred uneasily. "We've been through all this." "Agnes has admitted not everything," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "There is one part of the story that still does not fit. The note beside Sir Reginald's body, the penciled line added beneath his message, 'Too late, The cue was chalked for murder. That was not written by Sir Reginald. The handwriting is smaller, rounder. It was added afterwards, in haste. She looked directly at Geoffrey. You wrote it, Mr. Hargrove. You entered the billiard room after Miss Lambert had left it, after the cold had done its work. You saw your uncle dead, understood at once what had happened, and added that line to direct suspicion away from yourself and toward some unknown outsider. You hoped to make it appear a mysterious revenge killing. Geoffrey's face flushed dark red. That's absurd! Why would I— Because you knew about the forgery, Miss Marple said calmly. You and Mr. Baxter had been in correspondence for months. You encouraged him to press his claim, knowing the papers were false, because you believed that if the estate were divided, you might salvage something from the wreckage of your debts. When Sir Reginald threatened to expose the fraud and disinherit you completely, you decided he must be silenced before Sunday's announcement. Diana gave a small, strangled cry. Geoffrey, no! Geoffrey sprang to his feet. This is outrageous! You have no proof! I have a little, Miss Marple replied. The thread used for the bolt was black silk, exactly matching the reel in your wife's sewing basket, which I noticed yesterday when she was mending a glove. You took a length from it. More importantly, when you entered the room to write your note, you disturbed the frozen surface of the table. Your shoe, wet from the corridor, left a partial print in the frost near the bulk cushion. It matches the pattern of the evening shoes you wore on Saturday, which Grimsby cleaned yesterday and described to me this afternoon. Geoffrey stood rigid, breathing hard. Miss Lambert lifted her tear-stained face. It's true, she whispered. Geoffrey came to me on Friday night, after you had all retired. He said he had overheard his uncle speaking to the solicitor on the telephone, confirming the forgery. He was frantic, said Ruin stared him in the face. He asked if there was any way at all, to prevent the announcement. She covered her face with her hands. I told him about the dry ice in the attic, how it could make a room bitterly cold, how it vanished without trace. I thought he only wanted to frighten Reginald, make him too ill to speak on Sunday. I never dreamed. When I found Reginald dead, I thought the cold had been too much for his heart. I was glad. God forgive me, I was glad. Then Geoffrey came in, saw the body, and wrote that note. He said it would protect us both. Geoffrey laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. Protect us? You foolish old woman. You did the murder. I only tried to cover it. No, Miss Marple said quietly. You both did it, though in different degrees. Miss Lambert provided the means and carried out the physical act. You provided the motive and the attempt to mislead investigation. Between you, you killed a difficult, obstinate but essentially honest man who intended to do his duty by the estate. Lady Eleanor spoke for the first time, her voice shaking. Geoffrey, how could you? He was your uncle, your guardian. Geoffrey's defiance crumbled. He sank into a chair and buried his face in his hands. I didn't mean him to die, he muttered. I swear I didn't, only to be delayed. When I saw him frozen like that, God, it was horrible. I thought if I made it look like some maniac's revenge. He broke off, shoulders heaving. Baxter, who had listened in silence, now spoke heavily. And I suppose, was to be the scapegoat, the fraudulent American. Miss Marple turned to him. You were certainly convenient, but I do not think you knew the full extent of the forgery. Your father may have deceived you in good faith. The police will determine that. Diana rose suddenly and went to the window. staring out at the rain-swept darkness. "All for money," she said bitterly. "Debts, furs, club bills. Was it worth it, Geoffrey?" He made no answer. Miss Marple folded her hands. "There is nothing more to be said tonight. Miss Lambert, Mr. Hargrove, I would advise you both to write full accounts of what happened. It will go better with you if you do so voluntarily. Lady Eleanor will keep the statement safe until the police arrive." Lady Eleanor nodded, tears in her eyes. "I shall sit with Agnes tonight. She has been more than a secretary to me these 30 years. Miss Lambert rose unsteadily. "I am so sorry, my lady. I let loyalty blind me." Geoffrey remained slumped in his chair, a broken figure. One by one they left the room. Baxter with a quiet good night, Diana without a word, Lady Eleanor supporting Miss Lambert. Geoffrey followed last, moving like a man in a dream. Miss Marple remained by the fire a little longer. She picked up her knitting but did not resume work. Instead, she gazed into the flames. "Greed and fear," she murmured to herself. "Such old, familiar motives, and always, in the end, they betray themselves over some small thing. A thread, a footprint, a penciled line written in panic." Outside, the rain softened to a gentle patter. The thaw was almost complete. By morning, the roads would be clear. In the west wing, the billiard room stood empty now, doors open to let the warmth in. The ice had melted entirely, water pooled on the floor and dripped from the table. The balls lay in disarray, their frozen perfection gone forever. Sir Reginald's body had been moved to a colder outbuilding to await the doctor. The portrait above the mantel watched over an empty room, cue in hand, as though waiting for a game that would never be played again. Miss Marple sighed, gathered her wool, and went upstairs. Tomorrow would bring official questions, arrests, statements, the machinery of justice grinding slowly into motion. But tonight, the truth had been spoken, and the chilled hearts in the house had begun, painfully, to warm. Chapter 8. Thaw of Resolution. Wednesday morning broke clear and mild, the kind of January day that hints at spring even while winter lingers. The rain had washed the last snow from the lower meadows. Only patches remained in the shadowed hollows and under the yews. Water rushed in the gutters and gurgled down the drive, carrying away the final traces of the storm that had imprisoned Winter Manor for nearly a week. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window, watching the police car negotiate the muddy lane. A second vehicle followed, a black Humber with the county coroner's insignia. She had dressed with her usual neatness, a dove-grey wool dress, sensible shoes, and the lavender cardigan she had knitted during the long evenings of suspicion. Her small suitcase stood packed by the door. Downstairs, the house already felt different. Servants moved with renewed purpose. Fires were laid but not yet lit, for the air no longer carried that bone-deep chill. The west wing doors stood open to let warmth and light flood the billiard room for the first time in days. Inspector Craddock arrived promptly at 10, accompanied by a sergeant and the police surgeon. He was a tall, pleasant-faced man whom Miss Marple remembered from an earlier case in St. Mary Mead. He greeted her with genuine respect. "Miss Marple, I might have guessed you'd be at the heart of it. Lady Eleanor's telephone message was brief, but it mentioned your name." "I was merely a guest," she replied mildly, "but one does notice things." The formalities were brisk and efficient. Statements were taken, the billiard room examined, the hidden papers and remaining dry ice recovered. Miss Lambert and Geoffrey Hargrove made their confessions in separate rooms, each pale and composed in their own way. Miss Lambert, tearful but resigned. Geoffrey bitter and silent until the weight of evidence broke his last defences. By midday the arrests were complete. Miss Lambert left first, supported by a police matron, her small suitcase containing 30 years of memories. Geoffrey followed, handcuffed between two constables, avoiding everyone's eyes. Diana watched from an upper window, her face unreadable. Lady Eleanor bore the departures with quiet dignity. She shook Miss Marple's hand warmly in the hall. "You have saved us from something far worse than grief, Jane. Without you, suspicion would have festered for years. Now, at least, we can begin to heal." "There will be difficult months ahead," Miss Marple said gently, "but truth is always preferable to uncertainty, and Geoffrey is young enough to make a new start. One day." Baxter had departed at dawn, driving himself to London to consult his solicitors. He had left a polite note expressing regret for the embarrassment his unwitting claim had caused, and promising full cooperation with the authorities. Luncheon was a simple affair. Lady Eleanor and Miss Marple alone at the long table. Afterwards they walked in the gardens, where the first snowdrops were pushing through the sodden earth. "I shall sell the London house," Lady Eleanor said, "and perhaps part of the land, but the manor will remain in the family. There is a cousin in Canada, Reginald's great-nephew, who has always loved the place. He will inherit now, free of the old entanglements." Miss Marple nodded approval. A fresh beginning. Houses need young life, or they grow sad. They paused beside the west wing. Workmen were already removing the ventilation grill and repairing the small hole in the billiard room door. The table had been covered with a dust sheet. The portrait above the mantel watched serenely over the changes. Lady Eleanor sighed. Reginald would have hated the scandal, but he brought much of it on himself, his secrecy, his harsh judgments. In the end, his obsession with freezing everything in place destroyed him. "People so often do," Miss Marple observed. "They try to freeze time, or money, or affection, forgetting that life is movement and change. Hearts grow cold when they cease to beat warmly toward others." Lady Eleanor smiled faintly. "You always see to the heart of things, Jane." The Bentley was brought round at 2:00. Grimsby loaded Miss Marple's suitcase and held the door with old-fashioned courtesy. "I shall not forget your kindness to us all in a difficult time, miss," he said quietly. "You were a great help, Grimsby," she replied. "A good butler is the backbone of any house." Lady Eleanor accompanied her to the gate. "Come again in the summer," she urged, "when the roses are out and the tragedy feels far away." "I should like that very much," Miss Marple said. The car crunched down the drive between dripping trees. In the rearview mirror, Miss Marple watched Winter Manor grow smaller, a great grey house bathed in pale January sunlight, already shedding its shadows. The train journey home was uneventful. At the junction she changed to the little branch line that pottered through familiar fields and villages. Dusk was falling as the taxi from the station turned into St. Mary Mead. Lights twinkled in cottage windows. Smoke rose straight from chimneys in the still air. Cherry opened the door with delight. "Welcome home, miss. I've kept a fire going and a casserole in the oven. You must be fair worn out." Miss Marple removed her coat and hat. "A little tired, Cherry, but content. There is nothing so restorative as one's own home." Over supper she told Cherry only the barest outline. No names, no lurid details, merely that an old friend had needed help in a family matter, and that justice had been served. Later, by the fire with her knitting, she opened her notebook one last time and added a final entry. "Winter Manor, case concluded. Murder by dry ice in locked billiard room. Perpetrators, Miss L. Means and Mr. G.H. Motive and concealment. Motive, fear of disinheritance and exposure of fraud. All confessed. House will recover under new, kinder management. She paused, then wrote beneath, reminder to self, human beings are like gardens. Left untended, weeds of greed and resentment choke the flowers. But with pruning and care, even after harsh winters, new growth appears. She closed the book, placed it on the shelf beside others like it, and picked up her needles. The lavender scarf was nearly finished. Soon it would be ready to send to the parish sale. Outside, a robin sang from the apple tree, clear, confident notes that promised spring. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself. Another mystery resolved, another small corner of the world set right. And somewhere, she felt sure, a new puzzle was already taking shape. Perhaps in the next village, or the next letter that arrived with the morning post. Life, after all, was never dull when one truly observed it. She knitted on, content in the warmth of her own fireside, while the January night settled gently over St. Mary Mead.